She had nothing left. No pack, no pups, no reason to keep walking through the snow. But she kept walking anyway, because that is what wolves do when the world has taken everything from them. The winter that descended upon Ellesmere Island in the high Canadian Arctic was the worst in recorded history. Temperatures plunged to -58 degrees. Blizzards swept across the tundra for weeks without pause. The caribou herds that sustained every predator in the region vanished southward in a desperate migration, leaving behind a frozen wasteland where even the strongest animals struggled to survive. If stories like this grip your heart, subscribe to Arctic Wolf Legends. Now, let's begin. Kaya was 8 years old. For a wild Arctic wolf, that made her a seasoned veteran, a leader who had guided her pack through 6 brutal winters and raised 3 generations of pups in one of the harshest environments on Earth. Her pack had once numbered 14, a formidable family that dominated a territory stretching across nearly 400 square miles of frozen tundra and rocky coastline. She had been the alpha female, the heart and decision-maker of the group, the one who chose when to hunt, where to den, and how to navigate the endless challenges that the Arctic threw at them. But this winter had destroyed everything she had built. It started when the caribou disappeared earlier than anyone expected. Without their primary food source, packs that had respected territorial boundaries for years turned desperate. A massive rival pack from the northern glacier region, 18 wolves strong, and led by a pair of enormous males with pale scars across their muzzles, pushed south into Kaya's territory. The battle happened on a night when the temperature dropped so low that breath crystallized instantly in the air. Kaya's pack fought with everything they had, but they were outnumbered and weakened by weeks of failed hunts. By the time the northern wolves retreated with their claim established, Kaya had lost her mate, her 2 adult daughters, her yearling son, and every pup born that spring. She escaped with deep wounds across her shoulder and a gash above her left eye that would leave a permanent scar. Now she wandered alone. Dr. Elena Hargrove had been studying Arctic wolf behavior on Ellesmere Island for 22 years. She was one of the few researchers who maintained year-round observation stations in the high Arctic, enduring months of perpetual darkness and temperatures that could kill an unprotected human in minutes. She had tracked Kaya's movements through a GPS collar fitted 2 years earlier, and the data told a story that tightened her chest every time she checked the readings. Kaya was covering enormous distances each day, moving in erratic patterns that suggested profound psychological distress. Her vocalizations, captured by remote audio stations scattered across the tundra, had changed from the confident howls of an alpha female to weak, searching calls that went unanswered across the empty landscape. Elena had seen this pattern before. Wolves who lost their entire pack often entered a state of deep grief that was remarkably similar to clinical depression in humans. They stopped eating, they stopped responding to environmental cues, and eventually, many of them simply lay down in the snow and never got up again. Kaya was heading in that direction, and there was nothing Elena could do about it. On the morning that changed everything, Kaya was moving through a section of coastline she had never explored before. The blizzard had paused overnight, leaving the world wrapped in an eerie stillness, broken only by the distant crack of sea ice shifting in the current. The landscape was nothing but white in every direction, snow and ice merging with the overcast sky until it was impossible to tell where the ground ended and the heavens began. She almost missed it entirely. The sound was so faint that it barely registered above the whisper of wind across the snowpack. A thin, high-pitched cry that could have been a bird or the creak of ice under pressure. But Kaya's ears, honed by years of hunting in conditions where visibility was often zero, rotated toward the sound with the precision of satellite dishes locking onto a signal. She followed it to the base of a rocky outcrop, where the wind had carved a shallow cave in the snowdrift. And there, huddled against the frozen stone, she found something that should have triggered every predatory instinct in her body. A caribou calf. Newborn, probably no more than 3 days old. His legs were folded beneath him at awkward angles, and his brown fur was matted with ice crystals. He was shaking so violently that his entire body seemed to vibrate against the ground. His eyes, enormous and dark in his narrow face, stared up at Kaya with the glazed desperation of a creature that had already accepted death. Everything in Kaya's evolutionary programming screamed the same message: food. A caribou calf was the easiest prey a wolf could hope to find, defenseless, immobile, already half dead from exposure. In her current state of starvation, this calf represented days of sustenance that could mean the difference between survival and death. But something happened in that moment that science would struggle to explain for years afterward. Something that reached past the millions of years of predatory instinct coded into Kaya's DNA and touched a place that was older and more powerful than hunger. The calf cried out again, and the sound hit Kaya like a physical blow. It was not the cry of prey, it was the cry of a baby calling for its mother. And Kaya's body responded not with the surge of adrenaline that preceded a kill, but with something she had not felt since the night she lost her pups. A flood of warmth that started in her chest and spread through her entire body, melting something that had been frozen inside her for months. She approached the calf slowly, every step deliberate and careful, her massive paws pressing gently into the snow around his fragile body. The calf watched her come with eyes that held no fear, only the desperate hope of a creature who would accept comfort from any source, even a predator. Kaya lowered her head and touched her nose to his. The calf flinched at the warmth of her breath, then pressed his face against her muzzle with a need so raw that it seemed to bypass conscious thought entirely. In that single moment of contact, the boundaries between predator and prey dissolved completely, and Kaya made her choice. She lay down beside the dying calf and curved her body around his, creating a shelter of warm fur and muscle against the killing cold. The calf stopped shaking almost immediately, responding to her body heat with the instinctive trust that all young mammals show toward warmth and safety. His breathing, which had been rapid and shallow, began to slow and deepen as the immediate threat of hypothermia receded. But warmth alone would not save him. The calf was severely dehydrated and had not nursed since being separated from his mother, probably during the chaos of the herd's panicked migration south. Without milk, he would die within hours, regardless of how warm Kaya kept him. What happened next pushed the boundaries of what wolves were thought capable of. Kaya began to lick the calf's face and ears with the same gentle, rhythmic strokes she had used to stimulate her own newborn pups. The rough texture of her tongue cleaned the ice from his fur, while the repetitive motion triggered a calming response that was hardwired into the nervous systems of all young mammals. The calf responded by nuzzling closer, seeking the nursing contact that Kaya could not provide. But she could provide something else. Kaya had cached a portion of Arctic hare meat 2 days earlier, burying it in the snow less than a kilometer from their current position. She knew instinctively that the calf could not eat raw meat, but she also knew something that would later astonish researchers. Wolves possess the ability to regurgitate partially digested food in a warm, nutrient-rich slurry that they use to feed their pups. It was a behavior so deeply embedded in her maternal programming that it required no conscious decision. Kaya left the calf only long enough to retrieve the cached meat, racing across the snow with an urgency she had not felt in months. When she returned, she consumed the meat rapidly and then regurgitated it in a form that the starving calf could manage. It was not milk, it was not what his body was designed to process, but it contained the calories, moisture, and nutrients that his failing system desperately needed. The calf ate, and for the first time since finding him, Kaya felt something that she had given up on ever experiencing again: hope. Dr. Nathan Cole was an Arctic wildlife biologist who had been conducting an emergency survey of surviving caribou populations when his snowmobile broke down approximately 3 kilometers from the rocky outcrop where Kaya had found the calf. Forced to continue on foot to his emergency supply cache, he took a route that brought him past the shallow cave, and what he saw through his binoculars made him sink to his knees in the snow. A white wolf curled protectively around a caribou calf, grooming it with the tender attention of a mother caring for her young. Nathan had spent 12 years studying Arctic predator-prey dynamics. He had witnessed thousands of interactions between wolves and caribou, and every single one of them had ended the same way. This was something entirely outside his experience, outside the experience of any scientist who had ever worked in the Arctic. A wolf was not hunting a caribou calf. A wolf was saving one. For over an hour, he watched, barely feeling the cold that was slowly numbing his extremities through his insulated clothing. He watched the wolf check the calf's breathing by pressing her nose against his ribcage. He watched her adjust her position to block the wind when it shifted direction. He watched her growl softly at a passing Arctic fox, warning it away from the calf with the unmistakable authority of a mother defending her young. When he finally forced himself to continue toward his supply cache, Nathan's hands were shaking, and it was not from the cold. Over the following days, Kaya established a routine that would have been remarkable for any animal, but was almost unbelievable for a wolf caring for a caribou calf. She moved the calf, whom the research team would come to call Frost, to a more sheltered location in a natural ice cave formed by ancient glacial activity. The cave offered protection from the wind and maintained a temperature several degrees warmer than the outside air. She hunted with a new sense of purpose. Every kill was processed through her own digestive system and delivered to Frost in a form he could consume. It was an imperfect solution. Caribou calves are designed to survive on their mother's rich milk, not regurgitated meat. But Frost's digestive system adapted with remarkable speed, accepting the nutrients that Kaya provided and converting them into the energy he needed to survive. Within a week, Frost was standing on his own legs for the first time since Kaya found him. Within 2 weeks, he was taking tentative steps around the ice cave, his long legs wobbling beneath him as he explored his small world. And through it all, Kaya was there, guiding him when he stumbled, warming him when the cold became too intense, and teaching him the survival skills that he would need in the unforgiving Arctic landscape. But she was not teaching him to be a caribou. She was teaching him to be a wolf. Frost learned to read Kaya's body language with astonishing speed. When her ears flattened and her body lowered, he froze in place. When she moved, he followed at her flank with the disciplined positioning of a pack member on the march. When she howled into the Arctic night, he raised his own voice in a sound that was neither wolf nor caribou, but something entirely new. Their bond deepened with every passing day, built on a foundation of mutual need that transcended every biological barrier between their species. Kaya needed someone to care for, someone to fill the devastating emptiness left by the loss of her pack. Frost needed someone to protect him, to teach him, to keep him alive in a world that had tried to kill him before he was a week old. Together, they were something that had never existed before, a family that defied every rule of the natural world. And the greatest challenges were still ahead of them, because the Arctic does not forgive weakness, and the forces that had torn Kaya's pack apart were still out there in the frozen darkness, waiting. But what happened when those forces finally found them would shock everyone, and I mean everyone. 3 months had passed since Kaya found Frost beneath the rocky outcrop, and their partnership had evolved into something no scientist had ever documented in the wild before. Frost had grown rapidly. At 4 months old, he stood nearly 1 meter tall at the shoulder, his legs long and strong, built for the relentless running caribou were born to do. His coat had thickened into the dense, insulating fur his species needed to survive Arctic temperatures, and his dark eyes held far more sharpness and awareness than researchers had expected from a calf his age. He was healthy, he was strong, and he was completely, utterly devoted to the white wolf who had saved his life. Their daily routines had settled into a rhythm that blended wolf and caribou behaviors in ways that fascinated the ever-growing research team monitoring them. Kaya hunted during the brief twilight hours when the Arctic winter allowed a faint glow on the southern horizon, never venturing more than 1 kilometer from wherever Frost was sheltered. Kaya had completely changed her hunting habits, targeting Arctic hares and ptarmigan instead of pursuing the small groups of muskoxen that occasionally passed through their territory. Larger prey would require longer chases and more time away from Frost, a risk Kaya was unwilling to take. Meanwhile, Frost had learned to forage on his own. He scraped through the snow with his hooves to reach the frozen lichen and dried grasses beneath. This was a purely caribou instinct, not taught by Kaya, but emerging naturally as his body demanded plant-based nutrition that regurgitated meat couldn't fully replace. The combination of Kaya's protein-rich contributions and his own foraging had created a diet that, though unusual, was keeping him alive and growing. But what truly set them apart was their communication. Kaya had developed a range of vocalizations specifically for Frost. Short, clipped barks that meant stop, a low, rumbling growl that meant danger approaching, a soft whine that meant come close. Frost responded to each one instantly, his large ears swiveling toward Kaya's voice with the same attention a wolf pup would show to its mother's commands. In return, he had begun producing sounds that were entirely his own, soft grunts and clicking noises that Kaya had learned to interpret with remarkable accuracy. Dr. Elena Hargrove had been recording their interactions from concealed observation posts for 2 months. The footage she had accumulated was unlike anything in the existing literature on Arctic wildlife. She watched Kaya demonstrate how to test ice thickness by pressing down with one paw before committing her full weight, and then watched Frost copy the behavior using his front hoof. She documented the wolf teaching the caribou calf to identify the scent of wolverines, pressing her nose to tracks in the snow, and then nudging Frost to do the same, waiting patiently until he showed the physical signs of alarm that indicated he understood the threat. Most remarkable was what happened each evening when they settled into their ice cave for the night. Kaya would groom Frost methodically, her tongue working across his face and neck and ears, while he stood perfectly still, his eyes half closed in contentment. Then Frost would lower his head and press his nose against Kaya's shoulder, breathing slowly and deeply in a gesture that Elena could only describe as gratitude. They were not just surviving together, they were thriving. But it wasn't all easy. As Frost grew larger and his caribou instincts strengthened, moments of tension began to surface. Caribou are creatures of movement, built to migrate across vast distances, following ancient routes encoded in their DNA. Frost felt that pull, even though he had never traveled with a herd. Sometimes he would stand at the edge of their territory, facing south, his body rigid with an energy that had no outlet. He would stamp his hooves, toss his head, and make sounds that Kaya could not interpret, sounds that came from somewhere deep inside him that she could not reach. The first real conflict came one morning when Frost, driven by an urge he couldn't control, began to run. It wasn't the controlled trot Kaya had taught him, but a full caribou sprint, legs churning through the snow at speeds that left Kaya struggling to keep pace. He ran nearly 3 kilometers before exhaustion, and the unfamiliar terrain forced him to stop, standing alone on an exposed ridge, with the wind tearing at his fur and no shelter in sight. Kaya caught up to him minutes later, panting hard, her white coat steaming in the frozen air. She circled him with agitated steps, her body language radiating a mixture of fear and frustration Frost had never seen from her before. She barked sharply, the sound she used to call him back, but Frost did not immediately respond. He stood on that ridge looking south, toward something Kaya could not see or understand. The standoff lasted nearly 20 minutes. Then, Frost turned his head toward Kaya and made a sound she had never heard before, a low, vibrating hum deep in his chest. It wasn't a wolf sound or a caribou sound. It was their sound, something born from months of living between two worlds. Kaya stopped circling. She sat in the snow and waited. And after a long moment, Frost walked back to her, pressed his nose against her shoulder, and they returned to their cave together. But the incident left its mark. Kaya began to understand that Frost's caribou nature was not something that would diminish over time. It was growing stronger, and there would come a day when the pull of his instincts might be stronger than the bond that held them together. She pushed that thought away. There were more immediate threats to deal with. The rival wolf pack from the northern glaciers was still in the region. Kaya smelled them before she saw any sign of their presence. The scent carried on the wind from the northwest, unmistakable and terrifying, the combined musk of nearly 20 wolves moving through the territory that had once belonged to her own pack. She knew their smell intimately. These were the wolves who had killed her mate and her pups. These were the wolves who had taken everything from her. And now they were heading directly toward the area where Kaya and Frost had made their home. There was no possibility of hiding. Wolf noses could detect prey from kilometers away, and Frost's caribou scent was impossible to mask. Running was equally futile. While Frost could sprint faster than Kaya over short distances, he lacked the endurance and terrain knowledge to outpace a hunting pack over the distances required to reach safety. For the first time since adopting Frost, Kaya faced a situation where love might not be enough to protect him. The pack arrived at dawn 3 days later. The two massive males who led them appeared first, emerging from a ground blizzard like ghosts, their pale fur barely distinguishable from the swirling snow. Behind them came the rest of the pack, spreading out in the hunting formation that wolves used to surround and isolate prey. Their eyes locked onto Frost with the cold calculation of experienced killers who had already identified their target. What happened next would be told and retold by Dr. Nathan Cole, who witnessed the entire encounter from his observation post 800 meters away. His hands were shaking so badly that his video footage would later require digital stabilization. Kaya didn't run. She didn't try to hide Frost behind her. Instead, she did something that went against every survival instinct a lone wolf possessed. She stepped forward, toward the pack, away from Frost, and she began to howl. This wasn't the desperate, searching howl she'd been making for months. This was something else entirely, a sound Cole had never heard from any wolf in over a decade of Arctic research. It was a declaration, raw and powerful and absolutely fearless. It said, "I am here. This is mine. Come and take it if you dare." The pack hesitated, and in that moment of hesitation, Frost did something that shocked everyone, including Kaya. He charged. The caribou calf, barely 4 months old, lowered his head and ran directly at the nearest wolf with the thundering determination of a bull caribou defending his herd. His hooves, already hardened by months of scraping through ice and frozen ground, struck the snow with a force that sent vibrations through the packed surface. The wolf he was charging, a young female who had been edging toward a flanking position, scrambled backward in pure surprise. Caribou do not attack wolves. It does not happen. Every wolf in that pack knew this with the certainty of animals who had hunted caribou their entire lives. And yet, here was a caribou calf, charging at them with the aggression of a creature who had been raised by the most dangerous predator in the Arctic. Kaya seized the moment. She lunged at the nearest male with a snarl that echoed across the frozen landscape, her jaws snapping inches from his face. She was outmatched, outweighed, outnumbered, but she fought with the savagery of a mother defending her child, and that savagery carried a power that raw strength could not match. The encounter lasted less than 10 minutes. It felt like hours. The lead males assessed the situation with the pragmatic intelligence that had made them successful pack leaders. They were not facing a lone wolf and easy prey. They were facing something they had never encountered before. A wolf and a caribou fighting together as a unit, their movements coordinated in ways that created confusion and risk far beyond what either animal could have posed alone. The pack withdrew, not in defeat, but in the cautious retreat, predators who recognized that this particular fight offered more danger than reward. They melted back into the blizzard as silently as they had appeared, leaving Kaya and Frost standing together in the churned snow, both breathing hard, both alive. In the aftermath, Kaya groomed Frost with an intensity that bordered on desperation, checking every inch of his body for wounds while he stood patiently and let her work. He was uninjured. She had a shallow bite on her left flank where one of the pack members had gotten too close, but the wound was minor. They had survived. But more than that, they had proven something. They were not just an unlikely pair sharing space in the Arctic. They were a team. Partners who could face threats together that neither could survive alone. Word spread through the research community like wildfire. Elena Hargrove's reports drew scientists from universities across North America and Europe, all desperate to observe the wolf-caribou pair that was rewriting the textbooks on animal behavior. Dr. Nathan Cole's shaky footage of the pack confrontation was viewed millions of times online, sparking debates ranging from serious scientific discussion to wild speculation about the nature of animal consciousness. A team of caribou behavior specialists arrived to study how Frost was developing under Kaya's care. What they found defied expectations. Frost moved with the situational awareness of a predator's child. He read the environment the way wolves did, constantly scanning for threats, positioning himself relative to wind direction and terrain features in ways that no caribou calf raised in a herd would naturally adopt. He was quieter than other caribou his age, having learned from Kaya that silence meant safety. But he was still a caribou. His foraging instincts were intact and growing stronger. His body was developing along perfectly normal caribou lines, his legs lengthening, his coat thickening, the small bumps above his forehead, hinting at the antlers that would eventually grow. And deep inside him, the migratory urge was building like water behind a dam, pressing against the boundaries of the life Kaya had built for them. The debate about their future began almost immediately. Some researchers argued that Frost should be captured and relocated to a caribou rehabilitation facility where he could learn proper herd behaviors. Others believed that separating them would cause devastating psychological harm to both animals. Eleanor Hargrove led the faction that advocated for allowing the relationship to continue, arguing that Kaya and Frost were providing data about interspecies bonding and behavioral flexibility that could not be obtained any other way. The compromise that eventually emerged was simple in concept, but complex in execution. Kaya and Frost would remain together, but their monitored territory would be expanded to overlap with areas where caribou herds passed during their spring and fall migrations. This would give Frost opportunities to observe and potentially interact with his own species, while maintaining the security of his relationship with Kaya. As the first hints of Arctic spring began to soften the edges of the endless winter, something shifted in the world around them. The sun, absent for months, began to peak above the southern horizon for a few minutes each day, painting the ice in shades of pink and gold that seemed to promise renewal. Caribou herds, drawn by the returning light and the ancient memory of summer feeding grounds, began their northward migration through the territory where Kaya and Frost had spent the winter. Frost noticed them before Kaya did. His ears caught the distant clicking of caribou tendons, a sound unique to his species, produced by the movement of bones in their feet. He stood frozen, every muscle in his body taut, his nostrils flaring, as he drew in scents that spoke to something primal and undeniable in his blood. Kaya watched him from the entrance of their ice cave. She recognized what was happening. She had seen the same longing in young wolves who heard the howls of distant packs, the pull of belonging to something larger than yourself. She didn't try to stop him from listening. She simply waited beside him until the sounds faded and the herd passed beyond their range. That night, Frost pressed closer to Kaya than he had in weeks, and Kaya lay awake for a long time, staring into the darkness of their cave, thinking thoughts no human would ever fully understand. Their first year together was nearly complete. They had survived starvation, predators, the worst winter in living memory, and the constant pressure of a world that insisted their bond was impossible. But the real test was coming, because as Frost grew toward maturity and the caribou herds called louder with each passing season, Kaya would face a question that every mother eventually confronts. When do you let go of the one you love most? And what came after letting go would break your heart? Or maybe, just maybe, it would put it back together again. 7 years. That is how long Kaya and Frost had been together, when the world they had built began to change in ways that neither of them could stop. 7 years since a starving white wolf found a dying caribou calf beneath a frozen outcrop and chose love over hunger. 7 years of surviving together through Arctic winters that would have killed most animals alone. 7 years of proving, day after day, that the bond between a mother and her child does not care about species, biology, or the rules that nature supposedly wrote in stone. Frost had grown into a magnificent bull caribou. He stood over 1.5 meters at the shoulder, his body packed with the dense muscle that his species developed to survive months of migration across some of the harshest terrain on Earth. His antlers, which he shed and regrew each year in the ancient cycle of his kind, had become truly impressive, sweeping back from his broad forehead in wide, palmated curves that caught the Arctic light like polished bone. His coat was the deep brown and cream of a healthy adult male, thick enough to withstand temperatures that would kill a human in minutes, and his dark eyes held a calm intelligence that set him apart from every other caribou the researchers had ever observed. He was beautiful, he was powerful, and he was still, after all these years, Kaya's son. Kaya herself had changed. At 15 years old, she was ancient by Arctic wolf standards, well past the age when most wild wolves succumbed to injury, starvation, or the simple accumulated toll of life in the far north. Her white coat, once uniformly bright as fresh snow, had developed a silvery quality around her muzzle and ears that gave her a distinguished, almost regal appearance. Her movements were slower than they had been, more deliberate, carrying the measured economy of an animal who had learned to conserve every ounce of energy for the things that truly mattered. But her eyes were unchanged. They still held the fierce, protective fire that had driven her to save a dying caribou calf 7 years ago. They still tracked Frost's movements with the automatic vigilance of a mother who could never quite stop watching over her child, no matter how large or capable he became. Their relationship had evolved far beyond the desperate dependency of those early days. Frost no longer needed Kaya for food or warmth or basic survival. He was fully capable of finding his own forage, defending himself against most threats, and navigating the Arctic landscape with a confidence that came from years of experience. What he still needed from Kaya, and what she still needed from him, was something less tangible but no less essential. They needed each other's presence. The simple knowledge that somewhere in the vast, white emptiness of the Arctic, there was another heartbeat that cared whether you lived or died. Dr. Elena Hargrove, now internationally recognized for her groundbreaking documentation of their relationship, had spent 7 years studying how their bond challenged every assumption in the scientific literature about interspecies behavior. Her research had filled 4 published papers, 2 documentary films, and a book that had become required reading in wildlife biology programs across the world. She had watched their relationship grow and change and deepen through seasons of plenty and seasons of desperate scarcity, and she had come to believe that what she was observing was not an anomaly, but a window into something fundamental about the nature of love itself. But Elena was also a scientist, and she could see what was coming with the clinical clarity that her training demanded, even when her heart wished she could look away. Frost was changing. The signs had started 2 years ago, subtle at first, but growing stronger with each passing season. During the annual caribou migrations, when herds numbering in the thousands passed through the region on their ancient routes between summer and winter feeding grounds, Frost would become restless in ways that Kaya could not calm. He would stand at the highest point of their territory, his massive head raised, his nostrils working the wind for hours at a time, pulling in scents that spoke to instincts older than memory. The clicking sound of caribou hooves, the deep grunts of bulls establishing dominance, the soft calls of cows guiding their calves. These sounds reached Frost across kilometers of frozen tundra, and each time they did, something shifted behind his eyes, something that belonged to the world of caribou rather than the world of wolves. He began to wander farther from their shared territory during migration season. At first, just a few hundred meters beyond his usual range, then a kilometer, then 2. Each time he returned to Kaya before nightfall, pressing his nose against her shoulder in the gesture of reassurance that had become their most intimate form of communication. But each time, Kaya noticed that it took him a little longer to come back, that the look in his eyes when he returned carried traces of something she recognized but could not name. It was longing, pure and simple and devastating. The longing of a creature caught between two worlds, loving the one he was in, but hearing the call of the one he was born for. Kaya understood this feeling better than Frost could ever know. She had felt it herself in the years after losing her pack. The aching pull towards something that was missing, the sense that part of you existed somewhere else, and you would never be whole until you found it. She had survived that feeling because Frost had given her something to pour her love into. But now the same force that had once threatened to destroy her was working on her son, pulling him toward a life she could not share. She watched him struggle with it, and it broke her heart in ways that even the loss of her original pack had not. The turning point came in the 7th autumn of their life together. A large caribou herd, several hundred strong, arrived in the region earlier than usual, driven south by reports of exceptional grazing conditions that the unusually warm summer had produced in the valleys below the glacial ridgeline. The herd was led by an old matriarch named Merrin, a scarred and weathered cow whose knowledge of migration routes and survival strategies had kept her family group intact through decades of harsh winters and predator encounters. She was respected by every caribou in the herd, and her decisions about when to move, where to feed, and how to respond to threats were followed without question. Among the herd was a young cow named Willow. She was approximately Frost's age, with a sleek brown coat, alert eyes, and the graceful, confident bearing of a caribou who had been raised in a strong, healthy herd. She moved through the group with an easy assurance that suggested high social standing, and the other caribou deferred to her with a respect that was unusual for one so young. Frost noticed her on the first day the herd arrived, and Willow noticed Frost. Their awareness of each other was immediate and electric, visible even from the distance at which Elena and her team were observing. Frost stood at the edge of the herd's range, close enough to see individual animals, but far enough to remain within the boundary where Kaya's scent still marked their territory. Willow grazed at the nearest edge of the herd's spread, her movements gradually bringing her closer and closer to the invisible line that separated her world from his. For 3 days, this silent courtship continued. Frost would stand at his post from dawn until the light faded, watching the herd with an intensity that made him oblivious to everything else, including Kaya's increasingly anxious attempts to draw his attention back to their routine. Willow would graze ever closer, sometimes raising her head to stare directly at Frost, with an openness that, in caribou body language, was the equivalent of an invitation. Kaya watched all of it. She watched from the entrance of the ice cave that had been their home for 7 years. She watched from the ridgeline, where she used to stand guard while Frost foraged. She watched with the eyes of a mother who could see the future arriving and knew that she could not stop it, even if she wanted to. On the 4th morning, Kaya made the most difficult decision of her extraordinary life. She did not go to Frost when morning came. She did not take her usual position between him and the outside world. Instead, she climbed to a hilltop nearly a kilometer from where Frost stood at the herd's boundary, and she lay down in the snow, and she watched from a distance that said everything words never could. "Go! I love you. Go!" Frost sensed her absence before he saw it. He turned from his vigil at the herd's edge and scanned the landscape for the white shape that had been his constant companion for 7 years. When he found her, distant and still against the snow-covered hill, he stood motionless for a long time. His breath rose in clouds around his antlers. His body trembled with a tension that had nothing to do with the cold. Then he turned back toward the herd, and he took a step forward. The first caribou to approach him was not Willow, but one of Marin's experienced scouts, a mature bull whose job was to assess potential threats and new arrivals. He circled Frost at a cautious distance, reading his scent, his body language, his intent. What he found clearly confused him. Frost smelled like caribou, but also carried traces of wolf scent that should have triggered immediate alarm. His body language was Caribou in its broad strokes, but contained subtle elements, a particular alertness, a way of positioning himself relative to the wind and terrain that were unmistakably wolf-influenced. The scout reported back to Maren. The old matriarch studied Frost from across the herd with the calculating patience that had kept her family alive for so many years. Then she did something that surprised everyone, including Elena, who was recording the entire interaction with cameras mounted on remote-operated drones. Maren walked toward Frost herself, slowly, deliberately, with the authority of a leader who feared nothing in her own territory. She approached until they stood face to face, the ancient matriarch and the wolf-raised bull, and she extended her nose toward his in the traditional Caribou greeting. Frost responded perfectly. His body language shifted from the hybrid wolf-caribou stance he usually maintained to something purely Caribou, a posture of respectful submission toward a dominant female that he could not have learned from Kaya, but that lived in his blood, waiting for this moment to emerge. Maren accepted him. With that acceptance, the herd's resistance dissolved. Willow was at his side within minutes, touching her nose to his neck in greeting, guiding him into the social web of the herd with a natural ease that suggested she had been waiting for him as long as he had been waiting for her. The other caribou parted to let them pass, watching with curiosity but not hostility, as the stranger who smelled faintly of wolves took his place among them. For one full day, Frost lived as a caribou. He grazed with the herd, moved with the herd, rested with the herd. He stood beside Willow as the sun arced across the sky, and for those hours, he was what he had always been meant to be. But he was also something more, and that something more could not forget the white wolf watching from the hilltop. As evening came and the herd settled for the night, Frost separated from the group. He walked across the tundra toward the hill where Kaya waited, his long legs carrying him with purpose through the deepening twilight. Behind him, Willow raised her head and watched him go, but did not follow. Some journeys have to be made alone. What happened on that hilltop was witnessed only by Elena's long-range cameras, and the footage would later be described by viewers around the world as one of the most emotionally powerful moments ever captured in wildlife film. Frost approached Kaya and knelt on his front legs, a behavior that caribou almost never display, lowering his massive antlered head until it was level with hers. Kaya rose from where she had been lying and pressed her face against his, her eyes closed, her body trembling with an emotion that needed no translation between species. They stayed that way for a long time. The white wolf and the caribou bull, mother and son, pressed together against the Arctic twilight, while the northern lights began to dance across the sky above them in curtains of green and white that seemed to celebrate and mourn at the same time. Then Kaya did something that made Elena cry behind her camera. She groomed Frost's face. The same way she had groomed him on the first night she found him, when he was a dying calf with ice in his fur and no hope left in his body. Her rough tongue worked across his cheeks and around his eyes and over his ears with the slow, deliberate tenderness of a mother saying goodbye. She was cleaning him. She was blessing him. She was letting him go. Frost pressed his nose to Kaya's forehead one final time. A gesture that carried 7 years of gratitude, love, protection, and shared survival in its simple contact. Then he stood, turned, and walked back down the hill toward the herd, toward Willow, toward the life that his blood and his bones and millions of years of evolution had always intended for him. Kaya watched him until the darkness swallowed his shape completely. Then she raised her head to the sky and howled. It was not a howl of grief, though grief was in it. It was not a howl of longing, though longing lived in every note. It was the howl of a mother who had done the impossible, who had raised a child across every barrier that nature could construct, and who now had the courage to set him free, because she loved him enough to let him become what he was always meant to be. The sound carried across the frozen tundra for kilometers, reaching the herd where Frost stood beside Willow. He raised his head at the sound, and for one moment, His dark eyes looked back toward the hill, where a white shape was barely visible against the snow. Then he turned toward his new life, and Kaya turned toward hers. In the following months, the research team tracked Frost's integration into the herd using GPS collars and remote observation. His adaptation was remarkably smooth, thanks to the social intelligence he had acquired from his unusual upbringing and Willow's constant companionship. He demonstrated exceptional skill in resolving conflicts within the herd, combining Caribou's social signals with tactical awareness learned from wolves. He became a natural mediator between competing bulls. Most remarkable, his presence seemed to have completely transformed the herd's relationship with wolves. Under his influence, the Caribou in Marin's group showed less panic during encounters with wolves, maintained tighter formations, and displayed more organized defensive behaviors than herds without him. It was as if Frost's deep knowledge of wolf behavior, acquired through 7 years of living alongside a wolf, had given him the ability to anticipate and counter hunting strategies in a way that protected the entire herd. Meanwhile, Kaya returned to her solitary life with a serene calmness that surprised the researchers, who had expected her to deteriorate rapidly after Frost's departure. She remained in the area where they had lived together, hunting with methodical efficiency, like a wolf who had relearned the art of self-sufficiency. She was alone, but not lonely. Not in the way she had been before Frost. The love she had given and received had filled something inside her that could not be emptied, even by separation. She was complete. She was at peace. She was waiting. And what she was waiting for would come sooner than anyone else expected. 2 years after Frost left to join the Caribou herd, Kaya woke to a sound she had not heard in a very long time. It came from the south, carried on a cold wind that swept across the dry tundra, just before dawn. At first, she thought she was dreaming. The sound was familiar in a way that reached past her conscious mind and pulled at something buried deep beneath the layers of routine and solitude that had defined her life since Frost's departure. She lifted her head from her paws and listened, her ears rotating forward with the instinctive precision that 15 years of Arctic survival had sharpened to a razor's edge. Hooves. The distinctive clicking of caribou tendons, but not the distant, anonymous sound of a migrating herd passing through on its way to somewhere else. This was closer. This was deliberate. This was coming directly toward her. Kaya rose to her feet and moved to the entrance of the ice cave, the same cave where she had raised Frost from a trembling, half-dead calf into the magnificent bull he had become. The morning light was thin and grey, the sun still hiding below the horizon, but the Arctic twilight provided enough illumination for her wolf eyes to scan the snowfield that stretched out below her position. She saw him before her mind could fully comprehend what her eyes were telling her. Frost, enormous and unmistakable against the white landscape, his antlers wider and more impressive than she remembered, his body bearing the dense and powerful build of a caribou bull in his prime. He advanced toward her territory with the steady, purposeful gait of an animal that knew exactly where it was going. And he was not alone. Beside him walked Willow, her brown coat smooth and healthy, her movements carrying the careful deliberation of a cow guarding something precious. And tucked between them, sheltered from the wind by their joined bodies, walked a calf. Small, unsteady on legs, still learning how to move on the rough terrain, its huge dark eyes looking at the world with the innocent curiosity of a creature experiencing everything for the first time. Frost had come home, and he had brought his family to meet his mother. Kaya stood at the entrance to the cave and watched them approach. Her body, old and stiffened by years of solitary hunting and the Arctic cold, trembled with an emotion so powerful it seemed to shake the ground beneath her paws. She did not run toward them. She didn't howl, bark, or make any sound. She just stood there, like a white wolf against a white world, waiting for her son to close the distance between them. Frost stopped about 20 meters from the cave. close enough to be recognized, far enough to give Willow and the calf space to adjust to the overwhelming reality they were about to face. With his breath rising in slow clouds around his antlers, his dark eyes fixed on the white wolf who had given him everything, he stood completely motionless. For a long moment, nothing moved. The wind stopped, the snow ceased swirling. The entire Arctic seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen when two worlds that should never intersect came together once more. Then, Kaya took a step, and then another. And then, with a speed and determination that seemed to wipe 15 years from her aging body, she was descending the slope toward Frost, her paws barely touching the snow, her eyes locked on the caribou bull that had once been small enough to curl up against her belly to warm himself. Frost knelt down. He made the same gesture he'd made the night they said goodbye on the hilltop. He lowered his large, antlered head until it was level with Kaya's, and Kaya pressed her face against his with a force that seemed to conjure up every day they'd been apart. Every night she had howled into the empty darkness, wondering if he was safe. Every moment of pride, loss, and longing that had filled the 2 years since she watched him walk away into a life she couldn't share. Dr. Elena Hargrove, alerted to Frost's approach by the GPS tracking network and arriving at the observation point just minutes before the reunion, would later describe what she witnessed as the most extraordinary moment in her 24 years of Arctic wildlife research. Her cameras captured every detail with clinical precision, but no lens could fully convey the emotional weight of what was happening on that frozen slope. Kaya groomed Frost's face, the same ritual she'd performed thousands of times over the years they'd spent together. Her tongue worked across his cheeks, around his eyes, and over his ears with the tender familiarity of a mother who knew every curve of her child's face by heart. Frost closed his eyes and stood motionless, allowing the grooming to continue for several minutes. His body relaxed into the touch, with a surrender that expressed more than any vocalization. Then came the moment that would make this reunion legendary. Frost stepped back from Kaya and turned toward Willow and the calf, who had been watching from a respectful distance. He made a low, gentle sound, the same kind of encouraging vocalization that caribou mothers use to coax nervous calves toward unfamiliar situations. Willow responded by moving forward slowly, guiding the calf with her body, positioning herself and the baby within a few meters of where Kaya stood. The calf stared at Kaya with the enormous, unblinking eyes of the very young. He had never seen a wolf before. His instincts, encoded by millions of years of predator-prey evolution, should have flooded his tiny body with terror at the sight of those golden eyes, those pointed ears, those jaws built for killing. Every fiber of his genetic programming should have screamed at him to run. But instinct is not destiny, and this calf had been born to a father who knew that the most dangerous-looking things in the world can sometimes be the source of the greatest love. The calf took a tentative step toward Kaya, then another. Then, with the clumsy courage that only the very young possess, he stumbled forward and touched his small, wet nose to the wolf's muzzle. Kaya froze at the moment of contact. The sensation, so painfully familiar, so perfect, sent a shockwave through her old body, making her legs tremble. She was back to that moment 7 years ago, standing over a dying calf in the shadow of a frozen rock outcrop, feeling the first spark of something that would change her life forever. The same warmth enveloped her chest. The same fierce, protective instinct rose from somewhere deeper than thought or reason. She began to groom the calf. Gently, carefully, with all the tenderness that the rough tongue of a wolf could manage on the delicate face of a caribou baby who weighed less than her own head. The calf stood completely motionless, accepting the attention with the same instinctive trust its father had shown the day it was rescued. Willow watched with the calm alertness of a mother who completely trusts her partner's judgment. She showed no fear or aggression. She did not position herself to intervene. She simply watched with intelligent eyes that seemed to understand that this old white wolf was not a threat, but a grandmother meeting her grandchild for the first time. For an hour, 3 generations of an unlikely family shared the space around the ice cave where it all began. Frost stood guard, his massive body positioned to shield the group from the wind, his eyes scanning the horizon with the alertness he'd learned from the wolves and which had become his defining characteristic. Willow grazed nearby, relaxed and secure. The calf explored his surroundings with boundless curiosity, always returning to Kaya's side after each little adventure, as if drawn by a force that transcended their species. And Kaya lay in the snow at the center of it all, surrounded by the family that should never have existed, feeling a completeness that she had not experienced since before the terrible winter that had taken her pack. She had lost everything once. She had rebuilt her world around a caribou calf who needed her as much as she needed him. She had let that calf go when the time came, because real love means wanting what is best for the one you love, even when what is best for them tears your heart in half. And now that love had returned to her, multiplied and transformed, carrying the future in the form of a small calf who looked at her with the same trusting eyes his father once had. When the time came for the Caribou family to leave, the farewell was gentler than the one 2 years before. There was no grief in it, no sense of permanent loss. Frost touched his nose to Kaya's forehead in the gesture that had become sacred between them, a blessing that passed from son to mother and carried in its simple contact all the gratitude that words could never hold. Willow dipped her head toward Kaya in a gesture of respect that caribou typically reserved for their own matriarchs. And the calf, not understanding the significance of the moment, but sensing its weight, pressed his face against Kaya's one last time before following his parents down the slope and back toward the herd that waited in the distance. Kaya watched them go. She did not howl this time. She did not need to. The silence that filled the space around her was not empty. It was full of everything they had been, everything they had shared, and the absolute certainty that they would return. Because this was not goodbye. This was the rhythm of their extraordinary lives. Separation and reunion, distance and closeness, the endless cycle of a love that had proven itself stronger than instinct, stronger than species, stronger than every force that the Arctic could throw against it. In the years that followed, Frost returned every migration season without fail. Each visit brought new members of his growing family, calves and yearlings who learned from their father that the white wolf on the hill was not something to fear, but someone to respect. Kaya groomed each new grandchild with the same patient tenderness she had shown their father, and each one carried the memory of her touch into their lives in the herd, spreading a tolerance and understanding between caribou and wolves that had never existed before. Frost's influence on the herd continued to grow, astonishing the research community. His deep knowledge of wolf behavior, acquired through 7 years of living alongside a wolf, made him an invaluable asset in predator encounters. He could read the wolves' hunting formations before they fully developed, positioning the herd's defensive response with tactical awareness that significantly reduced predation rates in the areas where his herd grazed. Other caribou herds, observing the success of Maran's group, began adopting similar defensive strategies, creating a ripple effect that altered predator-prey dynamics throughout the region. But Frost's greatest legacy wasn't tactical, it was emotional. His story, extensively documented by Elena and her team and shared with the world through films, publications, and media coverage reaching every continent, fundamentally changed the way people understood the emotional lives of wild animals. The old assumption that animals acted purely on instinct, that their bonds were transactional rather than emotional, and that love was a uniquely human experience, crumbled in the face of evidence that a white wolf and a caribou bull chose each other as family and maintained that choice over years, miles, and every obstacle the natural world could throw in their path. Conservation programs across Arctic and subarctic regions began incorporating the lessons learned from Kaya and Frost's relationship. Cross-species rehabilitation protocols were developed based on the principles their bond demonstrated. Orphaned calves and pups that would once have been left to die or raised in isolation were placed with surrogate parents from other species. And the results, while never as dramatic as Kaya and Frost's story, showed that interspecies bonding could be a viable tool for wildlife rehabilitation when traditional methods were not available. Dr. Elena Hargrove's final research paper on their relationship was published when Frost was 12 years old, and Kaya was nearing the end of her extraordinary lifespan. The paper, which ran to over 80 pages and included data from nearly a decade of continuous observation, concluded with a passage that would be quoted in wildlife biology textbooks for generations to come. She wrote that in all her years of studying the Arctic, she had never encountered anything that challenged her understanding of the natural world as profoundly as the relationship between Kaya and Frost. She argued that what they had demonstrated was not an anomaly, but a revelation, a glimpse into a capacity for love and connection that existed throughout the animal kingdom, but was rarely observed because the conditions for its expression were rarely met. Their bond, she concluded, was proof that the boundaries we draw between species, between predator and prey, between us and them, are not as fixed or as final as we have always assumed. Love, it turns out, does not read the textbooks. It does not care about the rules. It simply chooses, and having chosen, it endures. As the Arctic sun traced its low circle above the horizon on a day in late autumn, painting the tundra in shades of gold and amber that mirrored the color of Kaya's eyes, the old wolf lay at the entrance of the ice cave where she had raised her impossible son. She was tired now, the kind of tired that went deeper than muscle and bone, settling into the marrow of her being with a weight that she recognized and did not fight. She had lived longer than almost any wild Arctic wolf on record, sustained by a purpose that had kept her going long past the point where most wolves surrendered to the relentless demands of their environment. She had saved a life. She had been saved in return. She had loved with a ferocity that transcended every boundary nature had tried to place between her heart and the world. And she had let that love grow beyond her, spreading outward through Frost and his children and their children, carried forward on caribou hooves across a landscape that she would always think of as home. The last howl Kaya ever let out was heard on a still evening in late November, when the temperature had dropped to -40 and the northern lights streamed across the sky in ribbons of green and violet that seemed close enough to touch. Elena's audio monitors captured it from 3 different stations, and the recordings would be played for years afterward at wildlife conferences and lecture halls around the world. It wasn't a long howl or a loud one. Kaya no longer had the strength for the earth-shaking calls that once echoed across her territory, but it carried across the frozen landscape with a clarity that seemed to defy the laws of physics, as if the Arctic itself were amplifying her voice, carrying it farther than any single wolf's howl should have been able to travel. Researchers would later confirm that at the moment Kaya howled, Frost's herd was grazing nearly 30 kilometers to the southeast. GPS data showed that Frost raised his head at the exact moment howl would have reached his position, if it had been physically possible for it to travel that far. Whether he actually heard it, or whether some deeper connection alerted him to what was happening, no one could say with scientific certainty. But the next morning, Frost left the herd and began walking northwest. Willow and their youngest calf followed without hesitation, as if they too understood that something important was calling them home. They arrived at the ice cave 2 days later, and there, curled at the entrance to the shelter where she had once warmed a dying calf with her own body, lay Kaya. She was still. Her white fur blended almost perfectly with the snow that had drifted gently across her body overnight, as if the Arctic was wrapping her in one final blanket. Frost stood over her for a very long time. The wind moved across his antlers and ruffled the fur along his back, but he did not move. Willow stood behind him, her head lowered, her body still, the calf pressed against his mother's side, sensing the weight of the moment without understanding its full meaning. Then Frost knelt beside Kaya for the last time. He lowered his great head until his nose rested against her forehead in the gesture that had been theirs alone, the blessing that had passed between them 100 times across 7 years of shared life. He stayed there, motionless, while the northern lights danced overhead in a display that Elena, watching through tears from her observation post, described as the most beautiful she had ever witnessed in 24 years in the Arctic. When Frost finally stood, he raised his head and made a sound that Elena's instruments recorded, but that defied easy classification. It was not a caribou call, it was not a wolf howl. It was something in between, something that belonged to no species and every species, a sound of loss and love and gratitude that echoed across the tundra and faded slowly into the vast silence of the Arctic sky. Then he turned and walked back to his family, and together they returned to the herd. In the years since Kaya's passing, her story has grown far beyond what a single wolf's life might seem capable of producing. Now numbering in the dozens, Frost's descendants carry forward the legacy of tolerance and cross-species understanding their grandfather learned from a wolf who, on the worst day of her life, chose love over hunger. The conservation programs inspired by their bond have spread across the Arctic and beyond, saving hundreds of orphaned animals that might otherwise have been lost. Eleanor Hargrove retired from fieldwork the year after Kaya's death, but she continues to write and lecture about the white wolf and the caribou bull, who proved that family is not about blood ties, species, or the categories science uses to divide the living world into manageable boxes. It is about choice. The choice to care for someone who is different from you. The choice to protect someone when the world tells you not to. The choice to love, fully and without reservation, even when that love asks you to let go. Every autumn, as the caribou herds pass through the territory where Kaya once lived, Frost still separates from the group and climbs the hill above the ice cave. He stands there for hours, alone, his breath rising in clouds around his antlers, his eyes fixed on a spot near the cave entrance, where the snow seems to settle differently than it does anywhere else. The researchers who monitor him say that during these visits, Frost produces the same unclassifiable vocalization that he made on the day he found Kaya for the last time. They say that the sound carries across the tundra with an unusual clarity, as if the land itself is helping it travel. And they say that sometimes, when the wind is right and the northern lights are dancing, you can almost hear an answer. A wolf's howl, faint and far away, coming from somewhere beyond the horizon. Coming from somewhere. That science cannot measure and maps cannot show. Coming from a mother who is still watching over her son, their story reminds us that in a world where everything seems divided, where borders and boundaries and categories tell us who belongs with whom and who does not, the most powerful force in existence does not recognize any of those lines. It never has. It never will. It just loves. And that is enough. That has always been enough. And if you stayed with us until the end of this story, then you already know that, because you felt it. The same thing Kaya felt when she looked down at a dying caribou calf and chose to save him instead of eat him. The same thing Frost felt every time he pressed his nose against the forehead of the wolf who gave him life. Love doesn't need a reason. It doesn't need permission. It doesn't need to make sense. It just needs a heart brave enough to choose it. And once it does, nothing in this world, not ice, not distance, not even death, can take it away.